for having me. Unfortunately, we are going to be missing, I think, a lot of glaciologists from the northwestern part of the US because this happens to be Northwest Glaciologists this week. So we will probably be missing those folks, but that's okay since you're recording this. But I'm going to talk today about controls on glacier dynamics. And this will really focus on work that my group has been doing on iceberg calving, looking at submarine melting a bit, and frontal ablations and frontal ablation as well for the past several years. And so this is work that I originally started when I was at University of Maine. I started there as a postdoc back in 2013 and then proceeded to turn into research faculty and stayed there for several years. And now it's work that my group is doing at Boise State. It is the Enderlin glaciology group because I think it's hilarious that my students are the eggheads. And unfortunately, IGS egg came around or just around the same time. But you know, I don't have any hard feelings that we have like competing egg groups going on right now. But so this is work that not only I have done, but also that a lot of my students have done. And I'll point out a lot of their contributions throughout this talk. And of course, it likes to give me a hard time. So for this presentation, I'm going to start off in a slightly non-conventional way, and I'll be talking about how I started my glaciology career. Because actually when I volunteered to give one of these talks, I still think of myself as being early career, but obviously Tavy does not think of me as being early career. So I was quite surprised when I was told that I have like a full 45 minutes. Hopefully I didn't freeze. So I was surprised that I had a full 45 minutes for this, but also in my department, we have started having our invited presenters give a little overview about themselves and their personal background before they give their talks. And I think this has been really great because it shows people that scientists actually are, individual people, and our science is shaped by our backgrounds that we have. So I'll talk a little bit about myself before I talk about the background on the work that my group has been doing. And then I'll talk about remote sensing of icebergs and iceberg melt rates. And then that'll transition into talking about frontal ablation more broadly, and also terminus change. And I have tips here for early career scientists inserted throughout, since I guess I am just on the mid-career stage of early career. I figured that some of these tips might be helpful to some other people. And so like I said, I'm going to start off with a little bit of background about myself first and my path to glaciology. And I want to start by saying really that anyone can be a scientist. And I am really hopeful that when people go to these talks and they see that there are people with actually really broad, diverse backgrounds that are scientists, that are all glaciologists, that hopefully some more early career people will be inspired to stick with that as their career path. And so, like I said, I actually put something on Twitter asking people if they wanted to hear this sort of information. And I only got 46 responses, but they were overwhelmingly quite positive. And so I'm hoping that this is helpful for the early career folks out there. And to give a little bit of perspective, I am an East Coaster. So it is interesting for me now that I live in Idaho, but I grew up in Pennsylvania. You can see on this map I have right here in this little square area, which is blown up here in Google Earth. The star is where my mom's house is still located. And if you could see the details around here, these are all cornfields. There was a pig farm up the road from my house. I'm very much a rural kid. I spent a lot of my time as a kid doing things like playing in the stream by my house. This green line here, this is actually the Appalachian Mountains that were a couple miles from my house growing up. So I could hop on the Appalachian Trail and go hiking if I wanted to. So I was an outdoorsy kid, rural sort of upbringing. And I was a really big dork. I was really nerdy. Still am, and I'm just proud of being nerdy at this point in my life. But this is actually a picture of me from kindergarten. And you can see I already had the gigantic glasses going on, and you would look at this little kid and you'd say, does this look like a glaciologist to you? And it didn't get much better as I got a little bit older. Does this person look like a glaciologist to you? Or this one? And the point of me showing these photos is not just to embarrass myself because I was horribly, horribly nerdy as a kid. but it's also to provide this context of, I was not a kid that you would necessarily look at and be like, oh yeah, they're going to do something that's like outdoorsy and adventurous as their career. I was a nerdy science kid. And I really give credit to my mom, who, I know this is a horrible photo of her, but I give credit to my mom for raising me to think I could do whatever I wanted to do, and really encouraging her kids that our education is very important. And my mom was a single mom for most of my childhood. And she went back to school and worked at nights and all kinds of weird times so that she could get her nurse practitioner's license and be able to better provide for her family. And she always raised us to say that we really wanted to get high education so that we could provide for our families when we're older, and we could do whatever we wanted. When she was in school, she was told she could either be a teacher, a secretary, or a nurse. And to this day, she still wishes that she had become a doctor. And so she really instilled that in her children of work really hard and make something of yourself. You know, it's all up to you. And my mom is an incredibly supportive person. In this photo, which is a horrible photo of her, I want to point out that she is wearing an Ohio State Buckeyes shirt, which is where I went to grad school, and a Boise State Broncos cap, which is where I'm now a professor. So my mom has always been really, really supportive of my pursuits. And so growing up in a rural place and having a single mom, I had to work hard to get a scholarship to go to college. And I did that, and I went to a private school on the East Coast of the US, Lehigh University. And I got really lucky that I took a class my freshman year with a new female professor in the department who really wanted female undergraduates to come with her to do research. And her research was looking at glaciers in Peru. This is Joan Ramage. She's still at Lehigh University. And this was this absolutely amazing experience for me because I had never even left the US before. Sorry, Canada. I did go there once when I was in like grade school, and I don't think that counts. I didn't even need a passport. So this was my first international experience. It was my first time being in like big mountains. I had never seen glaciers before. And I was just totally struck by how fragile these glaciers were, how sensitive they were to climate change. And also what powerful forces they are, looking at how they've eroded these mountains in these photos. So I was really hooked on glaciers at that point. And so this is my first threading in of that early career advice. And the reason why, again, I'm providing this background on myself is because this advice is based on my personal experiences and things that I have found apply to me or work for me. And maybe the same advice doesn't apply to everyone. You know, it doesn't work. It's not a one size fits all sort of approach. I hated when I had people that would come up to me when I was in grad school and give me unsolicited advice. So keep in mind, you don't have to listen to my advice, because this is really what has worked for me and what has kept me going, basically. And so for me, the first sort of thing that I got out of this, and I hope I'm conveying in my background material, is it's important to follow your interests. You know, you want to do something that you feel passionate about. And so to me, I got into glaciers because I felt really passionate about studying how they were sort of canaries in the coal mine, how they're affected by climate change. I was lucky to have some really good mentors. My mom is a great mentor. I had a great female mentor as an undergrad. And those things are really important. They really help you to grow and to thrive in an environment. And you want to find some people that are like you, but you want to find some people that are different from you. I mean, really the most important thing is that you find people who are there just to support you and to advocate for you. And so for me, this has been really important. And I stress that you want to find mentors. So you need to find multiple people that are there to support you, because everyone can provide different strengths. And I'm really sorry if you're going to start to hear really weird noises in the background while this is going. I have chickens. And so my chickens are deciding now they're going to lay some eggs. So it might be a little weird chicken loud noises in the background during this. But from there, I went on, I told you I was hooked on glaciology, so I went on to get my graduate degrees at Ohio State University under the supervision of Dr. Ian Howitt. And this is some of the great field work I got to do with Ian here in Iceland. You can see all the ablation that went on at this GPS site that we had installed one winter and came back to service in the summer. And when I was there, I also met my husband and I got married while I was earning my PhD. And I did catch some guff from people about doing that. But, you know, again, everyone's path is a little bit different. And then from there, I went on to do a postdoc at the University of Maine under the supervision of the late Gordon Hamilton. And this is I think this is a great picture of Gordon here from Southeast Greenland. He's standing on top of an erratic, and he was just such a great person, a great personality, a great mentor. And I actually asked Gordon to do a postdoc with him after going on a little field excursion for a symposium up in Svalbard. And Gordon just seemed to have such great ideas and cool science going on, and was a really enjoyable person to be around, that I went and I approached him and asked him if he would be my postdoc supervisor. And so I'm really happy that I got that opportunity with him, because he was also a really great mentor as well. And I bring up Gordon here because he was really important to me when I got my career going. I was a postdoc, and he encouraged me to then become research faculty and write my own grants. And that was a really difficult time, and it still is. All of us get lots of rejections when we write proposals. Lots of rejections. So this is just my list from NSF. Every red box shows you things that were rejected. I probably have the same length list from NASA with probably even more rejections in there. And so you get a lot of these failures, papers that don't make it through review or take forever. You might have some bad experiences, and you have to not let those things drag you down. So you have to have a good support network. And that's really important, to have you bounce back from the negatives, learn from them, but, you know, maybe have a good laugh about some things, maybe curse about some other things. It's helpful to have someone to do that with you, and to sort of have that approach to be like, okay, I've learned from this, I'll recover. And I also have this, again, you know, further embarrass myself, this picture of me literally falling in a glacial stream in Greenland. My colleague that was there was like, I'm going to take this great hero shot of you jumping over this stream. And I fell in it instead. So that was, you know, things didn't turn out the way I thought on that. But again, learn from those experiences. I was a little wet that day, but, you know, picked myself up and kept moving. And so while I was at a postdoc at UMaine, I also started my own group, and I had a baby while I was there, which again, people criticize me for doing pre-tenure, but I don't think that you should postpone personal successes and personal goals for professional ones. I think you should be able to accomplish those hand in hand. And I applied for, I'd say, more than 50 jobs in 6 years, and I got about 12 interviews. And I finally got my current job, my tenure track job at Boise State. So I moved my family across the country, and I've started my new group here. And I have my husband and my son in these photos here, showing you again, it's really great and sort of necessary to have a good support network, especially one that can make you laugh because they're doing weird robot dances. So now on to the science for this talk. I'm going to provide now some background on what my group has been doing. So what has motivated my group's research for the past couple of years? And really, this has all been driven by this modern glacier change. So you can see here a couple of different figures from different references. This is Alex Gardner's work from Science back in 2013, used laser altimetry to look at mass loss from glaciers outside the ice caps and ice sheets around the world, and found here that basically all these glaciers lost about 260 gigatons per year from 2003 to 2009. And then you see these more recent papers here from Eric Rignot and from Jeremy Mougenot, both in the National Academies in 2019, showing you that recently from Antarctica, we've been losing about 250 gigatons per year. And then from Greenland, we've been losing 286 gigatons per year. So we're losing mass from all of these locations. And what I'm really interested in are these dynamic processes where we have terminus retreat that triggers acceleration, thinning, and increased iceberg discharge. And so this is some work. These graphs are from a paper that I published under my maiden name back in 2011. This was from my master's thesis, where I looked at glaciers all along the west coast of Greenland, and I saw how quickly their terminus positions were changing. I also measured these elevation cross sections that you see here and speed time series that you see over here. And let me move this so I can actually see all of my figures. And so if we walk through this, you see the red lines on these two maps and these red arrows pointed at the speeds and the elevations in around 2000. And then we jump to 2009 with a cyan line, and you can see these cyan arrows. So what I want you to get out of this is that as these glaciers retreated, they thinned. You can see that from the surface lowering in these elevation profiles, and they accelerated. But the patterns are actually quite different between the individual glaciers. And this has since continued. So the glaciers have continued to retreat. We see that this is not something that's just a fluke signal. These glaciers are shrinking pretty much all around Greenland. And we look more broadly, we see that this is not isolated to just Western Greenland. This is a nice paper by Rachel Carr, where she looked at changes in terminus position here for glaciers in the 1990s. And these are sort of the regional values that are shown here in the Atlantic Arctic. And then again in the early 2000s. So you see that there's terminus retreat. And then this is by Allison Cook in Science in 2016, showed that, I believe this is from the 1960s to almost present, that these red circles, red larger circles are showing you where there were glaciers that retreated. And that magnitude of retreat corresponds to basically variations in ocean temperature. So now we're also looking at some of the causes here. So we see that this retreat is widespread, and it looks like there's an ocean forcing component. And Michaela King just had a paper come out this year where she looked at, does this retreat, is it really correlated to acceleration, thinning, and discharge? And these plots here are showing you the change in terminus positions. This is the front change on the x-axis. And then the y-axes of these are annual discharge here, and then the change in annual discharge. And so you see that as the glaciers retreat, they are pumping out more and more ice. When we look at her figures over here that are on the right, these are showing you elevation profiles as these solid sort of like gray lines on here, and then terminus change profiles as the squiggly colored ones on here. And so what I want you to see is, again, that as the terminus is retreating, these glaciers are thinning. So we see that there's this increase in acceleration, there's thinning, and there's an increase in discharge when terminus retreat happens. And this audience should know all about dynamic change, but I'll just really quickly walk through how I like to think of this to provide some context. I was always told when I was in school that you should describe this as letting the cork out of a bottle. I think of it a lot more like you're breaking a dam. And because essentially the ice that you have at the terminus is acting like a dam. It is providing resistance to flow caused by gravity from higher elevations towards the lower elevations. And so just like you see in this GIF of this dam breaking, if we remove the dam of ice at the terminus, then the glacier flow should accelerate. And if I throw up this really simple width and depth integrated stress balance equation, this should help you realize and see why that is happening. So I have my little labels up on here, but I'll walk through each term as well. And it's important to see the different factors that are at play in this equation. W is width, big H is thickness, little h is surface elevation, and U is the velocity. So if you look, all of these terms here on the right-hand side, all are a function of the velocity. And actually they all are a function of the thickness as well. It's less obvious with this basal drag term. And then this term here, the driving stress term on the left-hand side, is a function of the thickness and the surface slope. And so you can see here that if we change our velocity in these equations here, we have to change our thickness. That has to evolve over time in order to maintain this balance. And again, oh, sorry, now I've had like a tongue twister. So this left-hand side of equation, I have my labels wrong over here on the side, is my gravitational driving stress. And that's causing the ice to flow from uphill locations down towards the ocean. We have our basal drag term. This is a frictional term. It's a function of the roughness. So imagine a very rocky or very rough undulating bed will provide more resistance. It's a function of the effective pressure. So it's the difference between the ice pressure and the water from below and the speed. And the lateral drag is also a frictional term. So this is a resistive term. It's a function of the thickness, the viscosity, the width, and the speed. So the wider the glacier is, the less on average it sort of feels that friction generated by it rubbing along the rock walls. If I go back to my little flubber video that was supposed to actually play here, and I don't know why it did not, maybe it won't even let me play it. It is showing you basically that you have this friction that's generated as a continuum all around the edges of the glacier. And that is going to cause this sort of telltale parabolic velocity profile here. We also have the longitudinal stress gradients. I think of these as the push-pull stresses, or I describe them as the slinky stresses, because if you pull on one coil of a slinky, it's not just that one coil that moves, there are other ones that move as well. And so it's that transfer of stresses across the glacier. And so that means that if we have something happen at one spot on the glacier, its effects are not isolated to that location, they get transferred. And this is a function of gradients in thickness, viscosity, and strain rate. So again, that equation, you have to evolve your thickness as you evolve your speed. And so, all right, if we're thinking of this as breaking a dam, what is actually causing that terminus retreat? What is causing us to lose our dams that are holding back all of our ice? And this is a nice figure that I believe Lee Stearns ended up putting together for a review paper that Janika Tanya led this past year, where we're looking at this figure and you can see that there are warming air and ocean temperatures both at play, that they both can have an influence on terminus stability and terminus position. You can see that if we have some more surface melting that gets routed to the base of the glacier, that could come out here as a plume that can influence our terminus stability. That influences our terminus stability in this location right here. And it can affect the whole stability of the terminus. We also have these fractures that are causing calving, and the water can affect those. We have this warm submarine current here that can cause submarine undercutting of the terminus. That affects its stability. There are lots of ways that we can cause a terminus to become unstable. And I'm really interested in teasing out the effect of the ocean. So can we actually say what the ocean is doing, how the ocean is contributing to these observed terminus changes? And to give you some idea of what I'm looking at and what my group has been focusing on recently is thinking a lot about frontal ablation. And that is just the sum of submarine melting and iceberg calving. So my really simple cartoon up here, we have the ice flowing out into the water, and the terminus position is changing as a function of that ice flow, but then also of this frontal ablation, which is the calving of these blocks of ice here, and also melting in all these places where you see the red. And Mariama Dryack, my master's student who graduated back in 2019 from UMaine, she has this really nice cartoon in her paper showing you that frontal ablation, we calculate that as the difference between our velocity and our changes in terminus position that we can measure from satellite data. And so that's how we're getting at this. And when our frontal ablation exceeds our velocity, that's when we have our terminus retreat. Right, so like I said, it's this complicated process. It involves melting and calving. And how do we partition those two? Is it possible for us to do that? And when I first started thinking about this, it was during my PhD. I started thinking about submarine melting of floating termini in Greenland, and you can use the same approach that's illustrated here for Antarctica. This is using changes in elevation over time. This is a really nice paper that came out by the group at Scripps this past year, showing you melting for all of the ice shelves around Antarctica. And you can use this method where you're looking at elevation changes over time or in space to tell you about submarine melting of these ice shelves. You can use this also in places where glaciers have floating ice tongues. But unfortunately, in the Arctic, those don't really exist anymore. We're pretty limited there. So we can get these great data for Antarctica, and there's a really good time series of shelf melting that comes with this paper. So it's really extensive. It's a great data set, but we can't use this method everywhere. We're really just stuck in Antarctica. And even in these places along the Western Peninsula and where Larsen A and Larsen B collapsed, we can't use it there either. Okay, so we can't really figure out what's going on with submarine melting in these places where we don't have floating termini. So this got me thinking about how can we actually look at submarine melting? And this is work that I started with Gordon at UMaine. We said, all right, there are these new high resolution digital elevation models that we can make of glaciers and of icebergs. Well, why don't we look at iceberg melting instead of ice shelf melting? Because we can also look at elevation changes to get at that. And iceberg melting should also, just like glaciers, vary as a function of our ocean temperature and the shear of the water past the ice. And okay, we can do that. We can get these really nice DEMs like I have shown here. This is a worldview digital elevation model for the western margin of Thwaites. So this is actually Thwaites Terminus right here. And I'm sorry, I don't have a color scale on here. The yellow colors are at least 50 meters out, sticking out of the water. They have 50 meters surface elevation. And this sort of bluish purplish color, that's the melange and the sea ice in that area, so that's close to 0 meters. Well, if we can look at these changes in elevation over time for these icebergs that have recently calved, we can make use of those changes in elevation, our dz, dt here. The fact that they're floating, so if we know the density of seawater and the density of ice, we can convert that to a thickness change, that's your dh dt here. And if we then integrate that over the surface area of the iceberg, that gives us a meltwater flux or a volume change per unit time. Like I said, this method relies on these stereo worldview images that have been converted to digital elevation models. And I have some examples shown here in these figures for an iceberg in Sermelik Fjord in Southeast Greenland from July of 2014 for 2 different dates. And the difficult part about this, and the really time-consuming part, is so far this method has been manual. So I have typically undergrads and some grad students that have gone in and they've manually tracked these icebergs and delineated them. And if we had really short time intervals between our images, we could potentially use traditional feature tracking to track the icebergs, but the rotation is problematic if the icebergs break out of ice melange. It's also really hard to distinguish these icebergs in these fjords. So you can see in these optical images here, I can see this iceberg, I can pick that out, I can see it in my DEM, but then there's this matrix of all these little broken bits, these bergy bits around it, that make it hard for us to use automated methods to extract these icebergs. It also requires that the DEMs have really nice time separation. By nice time separation, I mean that it needs to be large enough that we can resolve elevation changes. Like you can see here in Southeast Greenland, this is less than a month. And our iceberg had this elevation, this freeboard of about 70 meters at the beginning of July. And then that dropped down to about 50 meters by the end of July. So, okay, a month is good in Greenland. But it has to be short enough that we don't lose the icebergs. And by that, I mean that they don't get so far away from the glacier terminus that their melting is affected by totally different processes. It doesn't tell us anything about the glaciers, or that they break or that they overturn, something that prevents us from being able to just infer submarine melting from them. And so like I said, this is a really manually intensive process. And so I really encourage people to collaborate. And I was pushed a lot to try to find senior scientists to collaborate with right when I left grad school. And that didn't really work that well for me. It didn't come naturally. I'm finally at the point now, 7 years post-graduation, where I've had more senior people ask me if I want to be on projects with them. But that wasn't something that organically happened for me. But I've been really lucky that I've been able to collaborate with peers. And I've also been able to incorporate lots of early career scientists in my work. And so my group over the years is shown in these photos here. The first one here, Caroline, she did a lot of the work for Greenland that I'll be showing in a couple slides. And really proud of her. She was a first-generation college student. And she has gone on to do really awesome things. I'm super duper proud of her. And then I have my group from UMaine right before I left for Boise State here. It's a combination of grad students and undergrads. And then these are my grad students at Boise State from a Christmas party I had last year. And then here's my group just having lunch this week. And I did, if any of you are on here, I did warn you that this was a horrible screenshot of some of you. But so I have both grads and undergrads working for me now. And my work would not have been possible without the contributions from my students. And so again, it's manually intensive. So again, this is looking at thwaites. And here we're looking at the same little orange iceberg in these two different dates. All right, that one's really easy to pick out. All right, we can use that for our analysis. But this big guy up here, right at the edge of the thwaites terminus, well, that one broke in half. So that one won't work for our analysis. So it takes a little bit of finesse to get this method working. And the thing about this is that we can directly infer this meltwater flux, the volume change over time, by looking at the elevation changes. But we want melt rates. We want that rate of melting orthogonal to the ice face. And so that's what I have illustrated with this arrow here. It's the area average melt rate. And to do that, you have to divide by the submerged ice area. And this is the part that is really unconstrained. We don't really know what the submerged ice area is. Icebergs can have all kinds of weird, crazy shapes. How do you account for this weird shape if it was below the water line? It's really difficult. So we have to look at a large number of icebergs and sort of look at the aggregate signal from them. And this is, again, Caroline Kerrigan, my undergrad from UMaine. She did most of this work here. These are all the icebergs that she got melt rates from over several years in Greenland. And here are some of the results. This came out in the Cryosphere back in 2018, where it shows the meltwater flux on the y-axis, and then the submerged area on the x. And in all these plots that I show you of the icebergs, I'm trying to have them pretty geographically arranged. So up here we start in the northeast and we go clockwise around, so we're going down south. And then over on this side, we're heading up the west coast and we're heading north. And so in these plots, that linear trend line, that tells you the average melt rate for these icebergs, and that's also listed up here in the top corner. And what I really want you to see is, if we look at this map of ocean currents, is that generally we find that the iceberg melt rates vary with these ocean water properties, these ocean temperatures. So in the southern regions, they're warmer, the melt rates are higher. So you move along the northwest, the water is cooler and the melt rates are lower. And then the melt rates are the lowest way up here in the north. There are some other interesting variations to that pattern that I've seen here, but I won't go into. Well, the really great part about this was when I started to dig into these data, this was all a pilot method, was that I found that if I plotted the melt rate versus the draft, that's the depth of the iceberg, I could start to see that in general, there are lower melt rates near the surface. And so this plot at the top is normalizing, so they're all on the same scale from -1 to 1. It's unitless. And you can see here from 0 to 200 meters, they generally have lower melt rates than they do at depth. And that's really great because I want to know what's going on at depth, Our glaciers are not just barely touching the water. They terminate down at least a couple hundred meters, some of them. So that's really great, and that goes with these modeled iceberg melt rates that are based on the thermodynamic equations of iceberg melt and ocean temperature observations that Twyla put together a couple years ago. So this plot is showing you, in general, there are lower melt rates near the surface, and then they get higher at depth. So this is great. This shows us we can really use these data to say something about ocean forcing of glacier termini. And now this work has been expanded by a huge number of students. Emily Miller was one of my undergrads at UMaine. Mariama Dryack was one of my master's students at UMaine. And now Caitlin Oliver, who is an undergraduate at Boise State, all worked on building this data set of iceberg melt rates around Antarctica. And again, we're starting up here. This is along the eastern peninsula. You go around East Antarctica here. You come back up. This is West Antarctica. You see we're in Thwaites. And then these are all along the Western Peninsula. And the different colors show you different years. I don't really see temporal variability in my iceberg melt rates, but there are huge spatial variations. And when we focus on this, all these ones along the West Coast here have much higher melt rates. I want you to point out that the scaling is different for these ones in the West than on the East. And those are all these glaciers that have this warm ocean water right at their termini, or we think it goes right to their termini. And these actually show us that it does. There must be warm water getting all the way to these glaciers in order to drive such high melt rates. So even if we don't have observations right up by the glaciers, that is what this is suggesting. The warm water gets all the way to them. And they match really what we expect from observations of also notice that these melt rates are orders of magnitude smaller typically than what we see in Greenland. So the highest melt rates in Antarctica are equal to the lowest melt rates in Greenland. And that's what we would really sort of expect if we look at the variations in the ocean temperatures. And so to sort of finish what I've been talking about with iceberg melt rates, I think these are really promising because when we start to look at spatial variations, we see some really interesting stuff going on there too. That this little orange symbol here, the coloring shows you the melt rate, and the size of the circle shows you how big the iceberg is, its draft. This orange circle right here is right at the Edgeworth Glacier terminus. This is along the East Antarctic Peninsula. And I believe there's a meltwater plume coming out there to drive this really high melt rate for this one iceberg. And if you look at, let's say, RACMO, it actually shows that there is no melting, no surface meltwater runoff that comes off of Edgeworth. So this is telling us that it might actually provide some insights into surface meltwater runoff as well. And we see something similar at Thwaites, that's this bottom image here. So again, the glacier is over here. And on this western margin where we're close to the glacier, we see very, very high melt rates. And as we move away from the glacier, those melt rates drop off. And so that suggests to me that there is a meltwater plume that's coming out from this glacier and is driving these high melt rates right here. So there's this potential that we can start to infer submarine melting of the glaciers from these iceberg observations. And finally, for Mariama's paper, she really wanted to look and see, well, can we get any sort of correlation between iceberg melt variations and glacier frontal ablation? And that's what this plot is showing you. It's showing you the iceberg melt rate for all these different sites along the Antarctic Peninsula, shown in this map, versus frontal ablation. And although there's a lot of scatter in here, what she found was there's a significant relationship between iceberg melt rates and glacier frontal ablation. So it suggests that even in this relatively cold location, that submarine melting of the glacier terminus is probably influencing the frontal ablation and the terminus position variability. And so I've been talking a lot about frontal ablation, and this is something that my group is now looking into a bit more. And I really want to emphasize, so why would we even look at frontal ablation versus discharge? Pretty much everyone reports discharge when we're talking about mass loss from glaciers. And discharge is really the flux across a gate that's near the terminus. This is a great data set by Ken Mankoff. He's working for GAUS now. And I'm just using this here to show you where his gates are drawn. And you can see these squiggly lines, and the orange extends farther. That's showing you that there is more ice flowing past these gates. So they're not right at the terminus because the terminus changes over time. So we're looking at this flux across these gates and we're saying that's the discharge. But I'm going to argue frontal ablation's better, period. It's better. All right, why? Well, it includes mass change due to terminus advance or retreat. And that's important. Some of these glaciers have retreated by kilometers. It also accounts for temporal variations in calving. We see that there's a huge seasonality in terminus position for a lot of these glaciers. So we're not calving in the winter months. And that means that discharge coming through that flux gate isn't actually making its way out into the ocean. It's being trapped by that normally ice melange that's formed in front of the terminus. And then it's suddenly released really rapidly in the spring. So our discharge should not just vary with our velocity throughout the year. It is due to this frontal ablation as well. We have to account for that. So why don't more studies report on this? If I'm telling you this is great, this is the way we should be going. Well, Bob McNabb has a paper where he reported frontal ablation time series for Alaskan glaciers. And you can see he has some really detailed observations for some of them. And Mariama, my master's student, she put these frontal ablation time series together for these glaciers in Antarctica along the peninsula. You can see some of them are really sparse. Okay, so what's going on here? You have to remember that this requires near synchronous speed and terminus change time series. All right, so speed, we actually have a lot of velocity data now for glaciers. We have these global velocity data sets, Go Live, It's Live. We have lots of ways to map velocities in-house if that's the route you choose to go. COSI-Core, IMGRAPH, IMCORE, there are other ways, not to mention that there are INSAR methods and INSAR data sets. There are lots of non-American data sets as well. So we can get velocities like fairly easily at this point, provided by someone else or calculated in-house. So what's going on? And I will argue here that terminus mapping still represents a real bottleneck. That's really what our problem is. GDIT, the Google Earth Engine digitization tool developed by James Lee, is awesome. If you haven't used it, it speeds things up so much because you don't have to download all of the satellite images. So it really helps with your time restrictions. But manual mapping is still something that's subjective. And the user is going to, or the interpreter, their interpretation is going to drift over time. So if they're doing this for months and months, later on, they might define a different sort of weird terminus that has ice melange. They might define the terminus in a totally different location than they did months earlier. And there's also this aspect to it, which I can't like overstate how painful this can possibly be. I mean, I have like satellite images of glaciers burned into my memory for West Greenland because I did this when I was a master's student. And you do want to hit your head off your desk after a while. So, let's think of a way that we can do this a little bit more efficiently. So I'm going to argue here that we really need to have automated terminus mapping. And my argument for this is this was before GDIT was created. I had an undergrad work, 8 to 10 hours a week, mapping terminus positions for the 641 marine terminating glaciers that are peripheral to the Greenland ice sheet. He was able to map 2 years, like literally one date per year for 2 different years over a whole semester. It's 1,300 termini he mapped over one semester. And got these really great results here. My students are starting to finally look at now. So here are some of his maps with RGI outlines here. And then we have this nice figure that an undergrad intern has been working on for me, Rebecca Mulheim from Carleton. She's been working on developing this really nice map here where the different colors show you advance or retreat, and the different sizes of the symbols show you the different sizes of the glaciers. And so with this really long-term time shot, we can already see there's some really interesting patterns going up here in very northeastern Greenland relative to, let's say, like what we see along the southeast here. So we're starting to see some really interesting variations, but that's 15-year time separation. That's not a lot of data. So my PhD student, Jukes Liu, she's been working on this project where she's developed the wavelet transform maximum modulus method. I'm sorry, it is a mouthful. She's been applying that to map glacier termini in an automated way. And so what is done here is basically you just start with a terminus box and a velocity data set, and you rotate your glacier into this sort of uniform coordinate system where everything's flowing from left to right. You apply this WTMM method, which is looking at gradients in brightness at a bunch of different scales to the glacier. And then you use these maximum modulus chains, which is what you have here. You use those to assign what is most likely to be the terminus position in an automated way. So you can see her result that she had for this one glacier here. And this is a paper that's in review describing this method. And again, you only need to have a terminus box and a velocity map. So it really doesn't require that much input at all. And then just automatically run this for, Jukes has been working on all of the Landsat 8 scenes. And we get accuracies that are really similar to manual accuracies in a variety of image conditions. So this is a really promising method. And what we end up finding, and Jukes will show more on this at the AGU fall meeting, she should check out, she has a talk, and you should check out, I have the number here. But she'll be focusing on the fact that we get these nice time series here. And we can start to see that for these glaciers in Southeast Greenland, outside the ice sheet, that there was this pattern where a lot of the glaciers started to retreat more in 2016. And we're looking at causes for that. We're looking at surface mass balance data and also ocean forcing data as well. But we're able to do this analysis by having these really dense time series that wasn't possible by manual mapping. And this is really great. Again, I know I'm running out of time, so I won't go into this, but we can start to look at changes in the shape of the glacier. And we're doing that here by pulling time series of terminus change at these different center lines or different flow lines for the glacier. So we can start to look at controls on terminus position. And Ginny Catania had a paper in 2018 where she talked about the fact that terminus concavity changes with stability. It's more concave when retreating. And now with a much larger data set, we'll be able to explore what is actually causing that in more detail. And so the next steps on this, I think these automated time series are fundamental. And I've talked a lot about frontal ablation, and I'll explain that again in a second. But I also think this is really important for them to constrain controls on calving. This is work that finally is now in press. Early career people don't get disheartened if your paper goes through multiple rounds of review. This paper has taken 16 months to go from submitted to in press. But Tim Bartholomew and I looked at LiDAR data for these glaciers in Greenland and mapped crevasses. And I have depths shown here in black lines. These are along flow, see down here. And then I have strain rates in blue and strain history or cumulative strain in orange. And what I hope you can see in some of these is that local instantaneous strain rates don't really line up with our crevasse depths. They're maybe not that predictive of crevasse depths like we've been thinking, but it looks like cumulative strain, that strain history is better because it's inheriting these advected crevasses, right? So that strain history accounts for that. So we need to look more into controls on calving, and in order to do that, we need these detailed terminus time series. Like I've been saying, we also need to convert to frontal ablation, and we really need to be able to assess controls on terminus position over broad spatial scales and a range of time scales to figure out what processes are at play. And if you want to read more about why these things are important, I really encourage you to check out that review paper I mentioned earlier that Ginny Catania led this past year. This is an all-female author list, which is awesome. And it's a great review paper, and it talks about future research needs at the end. So if you're interested in figuring out why I'm so interested in Terminus controls, you can go back to this paper and review it there. And so my last piece of early career advice is do what makes you happy. And each person has a unique path. So if you're unhappy, something needs to change. It's not sustainable. And so to me, these other things that I've talked about throughout are what have made me happy. Following my interests, finding good mentors to support me, sometimes laughing about my failures, figuring out how to overcome them, and collaborating. That's what has made me happy. And that's what has allowed me to follow my path. And so I really encourage you to do that as well. And so with that, I will just quickly leave this up here for a second that everyone can look at my take-home points. I want to thank all of the funding agencies for the support for all of this work over the past several years. And thanks to my group that I have right now, who's been really great at getting me some of the data that I showed in here. And so I'll end with forwarding you along to an advertisement for Richard's talk next week. Like Richard actually needs anyone to advertise for him, but you can check out Richard's talk next week at the same time. And thanks for your attention, everyone.
Thank you very much, Ellyn. That was absolutely wonderful. And thank you very much also for reminding us all about the usual trials and tribulations of any career path. It's something you kind of forget after a while, but you just get too used to it. So in the usual way, if people have questions, if people would like to pop them onto the chat, I can see one's just come there. Either just say you've got a question to ask. Sasha, do you want to unmute yourself and ask it in person?
Sure. Hi, Ellyn. Thanks for the talk. It's really great. So I had a question about, you said that all of the icebergs that you measured for melt rates were not broken up and not overturned. And I feel like that would cause an underestimate of melt rates, since overturned icebergs are darker and broken up icebergs have higher surface areas. So do you have an estimate of how much that underestimation might be and how that might change in the future?
No, so I mean, from my perspective, actually the most limiting thing about looking at the melt rates is, yes, those icebergs are going to have different melt rates than these other ones that I'm focusing on, but by far the biggest limiting factor is the fact that we don't know what the submerged geometries are like. And they're certainly way more complex than what I'm using. It's like a cylinder, but it's just the complexity varies so much from iceberg to iceberg. So no matter what, we're actually currently overestimating melt rates a little bit because we're underestimating the surface area. And that's something that I would love to look into more, but with the exception of Dave Sutherland's work, where he's been using sonar to map submerged parts of icebergs, it's really hard to get maps of iceberg geometries.
Cool, thank you.
I don't know if anyone, there were various suggestions made in the chat as the talk went on. I don't know if anyone would like to make any of those in person, Roger or Andre, or do you feel like those moments have passed?
No, Tavy, it's Roger here, and thanks again to our speaker, Ellyn. That was really enjoyable. It was almost a passing comment, but when you mentioned feature tracking, it reminded me of successes that I've seen when we've liaised with the movie CGI industry and games manufacturers, who remarkably seem to have spare time when we asked them if they wanted to help. And the application, as I say, is slightly embarrassing, particularly to this audience, in that it's interpolating frames of output from very big seismic processing tasks to try and reduce the amount of compute power needed to get them. But part of that is reducing the amount of air gun shooting that's needed to get the images in the first place. So that's an honourable reason. But the bottom line was these guys really have a fantastic handle on how to track unusual features. And pardon me, I'm just an ignorant seismologist, and maybe you know, I've seen a suggestion for something to look at in cryosphere. These things are already underway, but I just thought it might be a thought to put out to this very diverse audience. Thanks very much for your time.
If you want to send me who you've talked to in the gaming community, I would definitely talk to people about that, because I'm sure they have fantastic technology. It's like the oil industry has fantastic technology that don't let the rest of us know about it.
Yes, of which quite a lot is underused at the moment, which is arguably a good thing, but it does need money to pay for it to run. I am talking to seismic processing companies about whether or not they can divert some of their resources to cryosphere type applications. And as far as the feature mapping and the CGI people, we're lucky enough to have a performing arts faculty and a humanities and arts specific university close by. And remarkably, these institutions just said, yeah, we've got people who can spend some time on that, and we can share the algorithms.
Oh, cool.
So we just rubbed our hands and had a go at it. But I'll talk to the person who leveraged that conversation most directly and see if there's anything that can be done. But just go and ring Hollywood. They're not doing anything at the moment. They're not letting movies out. Thanks again. I'll stop the waffle now and turn it over to scientists. Cheers.
Thank you very much. We've got lots and lots of thank yous and applause on the chat. Are there any further questions at all, or have people finished discussion? Okay, I don't see any further questions. So thank you very much indeed, Ellyn. It was really, really appreciated, and I think this is a wonderful opportunity for people to just get a broader view of how science works, I guess. We've had a lot of people being a little bit more reflective, a little bit more open and more honest about their scientific career in general, and I think it's been fabulous. And I hope to see you all next week at Richard's talk, and onwards as we go through what, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, I think is going to be a long winter. But thank you very much again. And please say thank you to your chickens for their guest appearance.
And thank you, Tavy. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you very much indeed.